A lot of the MAGA base, the Trump support, are fed up with the $1 trillion spent on Neocon forever wars. We never hear an Iraqi, but from the perspective of Iraq, was the Neocon war in Iraq good?
I would say Iraq is very unfinished business. The war kept changing missions. It was about regime change and removing Saddam Hussein. Then it became about nation building. And in the middle of that, President Obama gets elected and decides to...
Let's go to Trump. I wondered what your appraisal was of Trump 2.0.
So I would say a much more chaotic player that actually is now becoming major one is Qatar and the relationship between him and Qatar. You have people within the administration now who have dealt with Qatar financially. Qatar is both the disturber and the solution at the same time. It's a country that funds a lot of militias and a lot of extremists all across the world. I would be quite worried about getting any gift from them. I don't know what is the Trump logic, other than it's a big, beautiful plane.
So, I'm going to now ask you perhaps the most controversial topic in the Middle East, of course. Do you think that it is good or bad that these nations are to recognize a Palestinian state? Before you hear from Faisal Al Mutar, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Faisal, exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll enjoy an extended conversation between me and Faisal, where he tells me about watching that infamous Sesame Street Iraq edition paid for by USAID, as well as an extended conversation about Hezbollah and various other things. But without further ado, Faisal Al Mutar. Faisal Al Mutar, thank you so much for coming on to speak with me on the show. Of course, you are one of the co-founders of Ideas Beyond Borders, but also a leading commentator and analyst of what goes on in the Middle East, of which there's much to discuss. I'm hoping to get into Syria, the latest in Israel, Qatar, and beyond in the region. Before we get into that, I wondered if you might tell me your story. You're from Iraq originally, and you came to being where you are today originally because of your relationship with Christopher Hitchens. And he was a war journalist was this about 2003, 2004?
So it depends on what the story begins, right? So well, first, thank you so much for having me. And I can tell you a bit about my story that connects to Hitchens. And which, I mean, I would say like he's been one of the most influential commentators on the Iraq War since the Kurdish struggle. So I'm originally from Baghdad. I was born in Babylon, which is south of Baghdad, and first under the regime of Saddam Hussein, then followed by the American intervention in 2003, liberation, intervention, and occupation. These are three terms that are used interchangeably depending who you ask. And Hitchens' actually first visit to Iraq was in 2003. So he actually came with the tanks. And he wrote this very famous article. And I didn't know him at the time. And
was that part of the original first few weeks, the invasion that would
topple Saddam Hussein?
Right.
And that was kind of the first wave and he came in that trip.
And you're a teenager at the time.
I was a teenager and I was not connected. So the way that it all happened is, so my neighborhood was taken over by Al-Qaeda in the 2003, 2004, 5, 6, and 7. How did that happen is that many of my neighbors were, many of them Saddam Hussein generals, and they were affiliated with the former regime. When the U.S. came in, many of these houses became empty and they get either filled up by some of those terrorists or allies of those terrorists. I mean, Al-Qaeda is also a very loose term because it used to be some of them former Saddam Hussein generals, some of them, et cetera, et cetera. So Hitchens came into Iraq in the second time in 2006. His first experience, and I think how I get into knowing him, and also is that he actually had a flip in terms of a change of mind, because he was expecting a lot of what was believed, that Iraq would be liberated and the Americans and the British will be welcomed with flowers and all of that stuff. No, that was not the case. So he came to Iraq and he stayed at the Green Zone, which is where the U.S. Embassy
in the middle of Baghdad.
In the middle of Baghdad, which is very heavily protected. The places where journalists...
Still to this day, by the way.
Not as much. So that's actually
Right.
one of the good news. It's now called the International Zone.
Right,
And it's
okay.
much more open to the public than at the time. But during his time, that was the kind of the peak of the Civil War. And so it used to be called the Green Zone and the Red Zone. And the Red Zone there were 3 hotels. One's called Palestine Hotel, Rashid, and Al-Hamra, where kind of young people like me, so that was, I would say, my first story with entrepreneurship. We go there.
The first what?
Story of entrepreneurship.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Is that we go there
Interpretership,
as kind of, we speak different languages, English and Arabic, and you go there, then journalist comes in and hires you to like, hey, we want a gig here, we would like to. So I've seen so many journalists who used to come to Iraq during that period. And then there was this guy that showed up who was surrounded by, like, he was very known compared to a lot of journalists who came into Iraq. And he was surrounded by a lot of people, many of them.
You didn't know him?
I didn't know him at the time. Yeah.
But you saw that people were gravitating towards him.
And he also knew like who they were, which is not very rare. And then we got to, and I was like, okay, who's this gentleman? And he was surrounded by actually a lot of people of the Iraqi opposition. The Iraqi opposition during Saddam's time. One of them is Barham Saleh, who became the president of Iraq, who wrote an obituary to Christopher Hitchens. And our first conversations was, so his relationship to Iraq started with the Kurds. So he was part of the international left. And many of the Kurds were also part of the international left.
And this predates the war?
That is during Saddam Hussein's time. Okay. And he got smuggled from Turkey to Iraq. So that was kind of the first stories he was sharing.
Hitchens does?
Yeah, Hitchens got smuggled from Turkey to Iraq.
Here's a quick word from today's sponsor, Ground News. Let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Trump's new tariffs using Ground News. Left-leaning Democracy Now! Ran the headline, "Total random chaos of Trump's tariffs are not rebalancing US trade." We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website helped me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any story like this one. There are over 160 articles published on Trump's new tariffs, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source context and key breakdowns. Meanwhile, right-leaning India Today led with, "Trump hits dozens of countries with tariffs, increases Canada's levies to 35%. Two very different narratives from the left and the right on the same story. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential to making informed decisions and spotting bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded. So, by supporting my sponsors, you are also supporting this show.
And he was meeting with a lot of this Kurdish opposition. He saw Halabja, which is one of the crimes that Saddam Hussein did, like mass campaign of killing. I think he went to the area where Saddam used chemical weapons. And his first questions was like, why is not the international left siding with these people? Like, why is these people, many of them are, many cases are workers' unions and workers' parties. And so he was like, this is a story that is not told, and the left is like ignoring it because it's done by another dictator that they probably thought was an anti-colonial figure. So that was his kind of first stories in Iraq. When 2006, and when I met him, he was still, I think he had a bit of a change of mind on the Iraq war. First, he was talking about like, he's still getting a lot of kind of dislike and fight between a lot of people within the left. Who really hated his support for the Iraq War. And the Iraq War was slowly getting unpopular at the time. But the main thing that I remember that was, I would say, really personal. So in the middle of these conversations, I asked him, so I was like, why are you doing it? I mean, why are you sticking to something that you know is very unpopular? And he looked at me and a couple other people.
Sticking to supporting the war.
Yeah, supporting the Iraq War. He said, I'm doing it because of people like you. And that was a really powerful moment. And I think that's what really signaled, like, Hitchens really cared about the people.
What do you think that meant exactly?
I mean, he really, I think, is a believer. So now he's dead, but like, he was a believer in the concept that freeing people away from authoritarianism. And he saw the removal of Saddam Hussein, which was kind of a symbol, one of the symbols of authoritarianism in the world, as kind of the key to liberation. So he was really like, I mean, it was a signal that he really cared. That was, unfortunately, his last visit, but he also gave me his email, which was hitchbitch@vanityfair.com. And he was sending, for me actually to establish a connection with him was, because he was like asking a lot of questions about Iraq and all of that. And I told him, I was like, well, my dad reads the paper all the time.
Your dad reads
the papers of what the Iraqis think about the war. So how about we stay in touch on that? Like I can inform you constantly about the Iraq war and what's happening, because I would say kind of disappointed, because like his last visit to Iraq or Baghdad, he was expecting a completely different thing. He was not expecting that the country would go into a civil war and he would stay in a green zone protected by Humvees and all of that. So and through that he like kind of was get updated. He was sending updates about his trip, and I think one of them was he brought his son to Erbil, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, in his last trip in 2007, and then he left. And I think that then he started. I think he got cancer at the time, and then he got busy with writing his books and all of that. But he connected me to some of the people who eventually got me my first career into this world. One of them is Jamie Kirchick, who is still alive. And he's like, there are these people, like, if you ever make it to America, you should connect to. And really kind of getting me familiar with the whole conversations about the Iraq. I mean, for me as an Iraqi living in Iraq, I had no idea what people in the U.S. thought about the war and all of these internal fights that are happening. So he was really kind of, he was informing us of what's happening in the West, and we were informing him what's happening in Iraq. And he was really cared about that. Even though, I mean, it was a controversial place, it's still, I think, one of the most controversial positions anybody has ever took.
To be for that war.
Yeah. I mean, I think in hindsight now, I look at it now living in the West, I think it really kind of damaged a lot of the Western and U.S. credibility in interventions in the Middle East. I mean, the whole kind of project about Afghanistan and Iraq hasn't gone really well, as you probably know.
So the reason why the Iraq war comes up and Iraq comes up in the news in the West today, it actually comes up very regularly.
As a warning sign, right?
The so-called Neocon forever wars for regime change is an absolute talking point in certainly conservative discourse, but really across the board. And this came up again in the 12-day war with Iran, 2 months ago. The Americans, a lot of the MAGA base, the Trump support, are fed up, certainly with $1 trillion spent on these neocon forever wars, that they saw that none of these regime changes actually seemed to work out. And so it's become an absolute key aspect now for a lot of, certainly in America, thinking. It's been hugely, I would argue, in fact, I would argue that it's one of the key things that inspired the success of the populist movement in America. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you, with all of that in mind, is from the point of Iraq, was the Iraq war, the Americans and the British and allied Western forces coming to Iraq, was that Iraq war, 1 million dead? Was it actually good or bad for Iraq? We never hear an Iraqi perspective, but from the perspective of Iraq, was the neocon war in Iraq good?
Bringing back to Christopher Hitchens, I think that the people who benefited the most from the Iraq war are the Kurds. There's no doubt about that. From the beginning of the no-fly zone that was established in 1991 into the dismantling of Saddam Hussein, you compare the pictures of Kurdistan region from the early 80s and the 90s to 2000 and where it is right now, where there's a massive skyscraper and a kind of a more flourishing economy than the rest of the country. For that, it was a success. And however, I would say Iraq is very unfinished business. Part of it actually comes in after the war itself. The war kept changing missions, number one. So at the beginning, it was about regime change and removing Saddam Hussein. Then it became about nation building. Then it became about counterterrorism. And in the middle of that, President Obama gets elected and decides to, the conclusion of many Iraqis is handing Iraq to Iran, pretty much. Which here is Iran leaving the country with no established governance, no strong military, no united military. So I completely understand the frustration where it comes from, because it is an unfinished business for most Iraqis, is that the country pretty much switched from one authoritarianism to a proxy authoritarianism, which is what we have right now. You land in Baghdad International Airport and you drive less than a kilometer away and you see a picture of Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the infamous Iran general, who was killed in Baghdad. And so I would say from the Iraqi perspective, it's really the beneficiaries are definitely, there's the Kurdish perspective and the Iraqi perspective in this subject. And the Kurdish perspective, yes, totally worth it. I think they're, and that's why you see Americans walking quite safely around Kurdistan without worried of being shot. That is not the case if they walk in Baghdad. All the embassy staff are in the green zone. They're very protected. They don't interact with the local population, which means that's how you know the country is not great, right? When the embassy staff cannot leave it's the place where they work in, you know where the situation is really bad. So yes, now what we have seen with the consequent policies of really, and that's I think what Hitchens was also kind of alluding to, of the betrayal of Western support, is like even when there was support, what happened in the Iraq war, then the support was pulled out, and then eventually, while the other ones like Iranians and sometimes the Russians and the Chinese, they stuck to their mission. While the Americans, when they saw it was getting a bit difficult, they withdrew and then handed Iraq to Iran, despite Iraq being one of the largest producers of oil in the world. So in a way is that they handed the Chinese, you go to southern Iraq right now, most of the oil companies are Chinese. So pretty much they handed a massive source of natural gas and oil to China and Iran. So it's really, I think, from either side, nobody was benefiting from that. Neither the Americans benefited from the war, so you cannot make the claim that in a transactional way that America made a lot of money from Iraq, because the Chinese made more money. And the Iraqi ways, when the Chinese make more money, they don't even hire the locals. So in a way, most of the Chinese companies hire their own people, and eventually none of the Iraqis benefit, and now Iranians have pretty much control of the security. Right. So I think, obviously now in hindsight, it all makes kind of in a more coherent way. But at the time when Hitchens visited, that was not the case. It was one enemy called Al-Qaeda, and the U.S. Army had a presence, so there was no stronger presence of the Iranian. Like you don't see Iranian flags everywhere, but now you see a lot of parts of southern Iraq. There are Iranian flags everywhere. So really, what benefit did that have?
So I was in Iraq in 2022, and I can absolutely vouch for what you're saying, that walking around the northern Kurdistan, this sort of semi-autonomous region, happy as Larry, safest houses, and had a great time. When I was in federal Iraq, and this is walking around Baghdad and
the south,
and the south, it's pretty edgy. Now let's hone in on this change with Obama. This seems to be quite key, because we're also now, Trump's foreign policy seems to be quite almost opposite of Obama in several domains. So take me to this moment where Obama changes his tack with Iran with regards to Iraq.
So in 2009, one of the main campaign thing that Obama ran on was the withdrawal from Iraq. Prior to that, the Bush administration signed something called the Status of Forces Agreement, which is kind of the U.S. withdrawal with a lot of conditions, which is exactly what we kind of had in with Afghanistan. But none of these conditions were actually kind of met. Some of it was like the strengthening of the Iraqi forces, lack of intervention from foreign countries, most importantly Iran. Obama came into power with this concept called the Obama Doctrine, which is in a way, in theory, like you can see that this person is an academic and never experienced anything in real life. That's the Obama Doctrine 101. His main hypothesis was, if he looked at the Middle East as a battle that went for thousands of years, most of it had to do with the sectarian forces of Sunnis versus Shias. And if we just empower the Iranians a little bit, instead of them being like the pariah of the region, suddenly the Iranians will calm down. That was the main hypothesis, that if we just contain them and really kind of give them what they want, which eventually ended up what's now called the axis of resistance and their control of the entire Shia majority states, they would be kind of calmed down, and there will be kind of an equilibrium between the Sunni forces and the Shia forces, and then there will be a peace happen as a result of that. Might sound nice in a Harvard workshop in Massachusetts, but that's not how the region works.
Yes.
Trump, I think, on the other hand, works a lot of it with instinct. I mean, I don't say he has a coherent policy, but his instinct is like, within the region you have to pick sides, and there is the side that I would say more aligned with U.S. values, or not only U.S. values but U.S. interests directly, which are the Gulf states and also Israel. There's this side, and that's the side of where if we give them money and they give them security, they give us oil, they give us gas and investments, and he went to the region, brought back $5 trillion, and it's all part of their economic plan, and called it a night. And that, I think, has much, it doesn't talk in this whole, we're here to bring you democracy and human rights, and is that we have interest and you have interest, so let's work together to make something work out of it. Without creating this weird equilibrium in which the Iranians empower you and are empowered over you, and they can blow you out at any moment, in which you don't know what your future is. Because the moment the Iranians get empowered, their way is not more construction and more development, is that they start funding militias and they start blowing things up. And I mean, other than the Israel subject, I mean, Aramco, which is the largest oil company in Saudi Arabia, was attacked by Iranian proxies. The Abu Dhabi airport was attacked by Iranian proxies. When they saw they actually have more money, they didn't use it to funnel that money of how to make the Iranian economy better. They funneled it to actually create an entire proxy militia group. And that actually goes to the ideology of Iran as we know it today. I mean, Iran has a regular army, but it also has something called the IRGC, which is the Revolutionary Army. And the Revolutionary Army, in some extent, is also ideas beyond borders. So they don't believe in the concept of borders, and they think that their mission is not necessarily defending the nation state of Iran within these specific borders, but to spread the ideals of the Islamic Revolution. And when there is more funding going into that, which is what happened during the Obama containment strategy, they funneled that money in that project, not in the nation of Iran with its hospitals or schools, but rather spreading the revolution. And that eventually, now it became a buzzword when people say, Obama created ISIS. But the containment strategy empowered Iran, that empowered proxy Sunni states or proxy Sunni militias that were fighting against Iran. When I was growing up and Al-Qaeda was recruiting people by the hundreds, their main point was not just, let's fight the American colonizing force, was we are here to protect you as Sunnis from Iranian aggression. That is how ISIS and Al-Qaeda and many of these terrorist groups, it was most of the issues that they were fighting for were actually domestic. And if your name is Faisal and your name is Omar or your name is Uthman, you drive across Baghdad, they stop you, your name is Omar, because Omar is mostly a Sunni name, they beat you up, they might kill members of your family. Well, that is a recruitment ground for Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they go to there. So that is what the empowerment of Iran means. It's more discrimination against Sunnis, which gets them more radicalized. And then eventually the states that cannot fight them, they start funding proxy militias like what we know. And then these take the fight against Iran. And that also connects with the Syria subject, in which a lot of people were funding HTS and other forces as not just against Assad, but also against the Iranian influence, because Syria was part of the axis of resistance.
Yes. We'll come back to Syria and Iran. But just on Obama, so as well as the point you make about the sort of Obama geopolitical worldview was trying to create an equilibrium by empowering, just maybe you had sort of two equal forces, rather sort of the two axes were pitted against each other. It spoke to Ambassador Michael Oren, is Israeli ambassador,
Yeah.
living in DC at the time, I think, of the JCPOA, or at least the negotiations. The JCPOA is the famous Iran
deal.
nuclear deal, which I believe was 2015.
Which I always compare my relationships to. So like always my relationships are better than the Iran deal. That's good. So whenever my relationship is terrible, I always remember that it was better than the Iran deal, because it's a gold standard of what a terrible deal looks like.
Really?
Yeah, in my opinion.
So can you spell out why you thought that was such a terrible deal?
Number one, it was temporary. It doesn't prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. There was a timeline in which they had to abide by, and if the deal ends, the deal ends. The Obama justification, well, this is just a leeway for us to get a better deal. The way that the Iranians saw it was America is so weak right now that they want to make a deal with us. That's where most, if any analyst who's now with the power of artificial intelligence, you can know what the Iranian media talks about or used to talk about. They saw this as like, oh, America is weak, and they're coming in the negotiating table. And that's a very terrible way to make a deal, and that's also a continuation of the messaging that we lost in the Middle East, end the forever wars, we're sick of the Middle East. What the Iranians understood that is like, hey, these Americans are leaving, and they're going to pretty much accept everything we're giving them. How that ended up affecting is Iran getting more money. And Iran getting more money, more militias get funded, more destabilization of the entire region. And I think that also played a major role of why we had ISIS, why we had a lot of these terrorist groups. Is Iran empowered means more of these militias popping up as the defender of the Sunnis against Iran. And that's what, so really, in any shape or form, I haven't seen any positive argument of why the Iran deal or the containment strategy has led to more regional integration, more prosperity. In fact, I would say it led to more destruction and more militias getting empowered, and we're seeing them all the way from, it's primarily Syria, but you see it in southern Lebanon, where I know you've been. You see it in Iraq. That's where they use the money.
Yes.
That's the money they get from the JCPOA, from the Iran deal.
Yes.
They didn't, none of that money was, or it was funneled to build more uranium enrichment, and assuming it doesn't fit that percentages level, and they know how to play the game of like, no, we're not going to go through this. But at the end of the day, the entire region gets destabilized. Every time Iran gets empowered, the entire region is going to more destruction.
Yes. Well, to finish my earlier point, I was going to say the other ideology, as Michael Oren argued to me, was that Obama had a sort of progressive worldview where he believed, and I think many progressives do, that everyone just wants to get along. Everyone just wants safety in the family and to be left alone, which is why that Obama sort of assumed, well, maybe if we encourage and support Iran, they'll just stop being aggressive and attacking, and they'll back off.
There's two nations, if you're going to take a very big level nation on the Middle East, there are two nations to some extent exist because of an ideology, and that is Iran and Israel. Israel exists because of Zionism, and Iran exists because of Islamic Revolution. These are kind of the two powers in the region. Like if you look at every other country, like Saudi Arabia doesn't have an ideology. They have a vision, but they don't have an ideology. It used to be the Wahhabism and the support of the Wahhabi schools in Pakistan and all of that stuff. As a kingdom, but they don't really have set of values that they export around the world. In the Israeli case, it's mostly centralized among Jews, but in the Iranian case, it's not centralized. They believe everybody should be part of the revolution, including, most importantly, the Shias. So they are not, when they get more money, their investments is invested in that ideology, as expansion of that ideology. And so they're not going to play along. Like they would be like, hey, they look at their budgets, and if we have $100 billion came in, what we're going to invest it in. We see that there are some opportunities opened up for us. We see United States withdrew from Iraq. Okay, that's a great place to make an investment for us to empower the militias and destabilize. We see it in Yemen. We see it in Syria. So this is how they use, how they take it, because they are, compared to that, Oman is a country that's a kingdom and they have a different sect within Islam that lives in Oman, but they're not planning to export it, and they don't see themselves as a part of a revolutionary project. Iran and all the country in the region, and Israel, which kind of, as I said, more centric around Jews, as the only country that has an ideology that they want to spread.
So let's go to Trump. I wondered whether I might have your appraisal of his foreign policy in the Middle East.
Trump 1 or Trump 2 is also another question, right?
Well, that is a good question. Perhaps we can look at the difference. But let's start with what's going on right now. So you've already alluded to his Qatar deal and the money and the airplane he took home, having spoken to the Qataris there. And only last week, under American pressure, the Lebanese government are being encouraged to disarm Hezbollah, which is something that has been spoken about and agreed technically, I think, several times over the last 20 years, but never actually any real attempt has been made at doing it. Not only that, of course, we have what's going on in Israel and Gaza, and so the American influence is very strong there. I wondered if what your appraisal was of Trump 2.0.
So I would say much more chaotic than the Trump 1.0. I mean, if you look at some of the former administration, you had Mike Pompeo and you had Mike Pence with kind of a very cohesive strategy about the world, which I would say is like the traditional Republican kind of approach to, which is in many cases side with our allies and fight our enemies. That's as simple as that. The second administration actually has a lot of different ideology within it. You had J.D. Vance, who in many cases comes from the isolationist school.
Yes.
You have Tulsi Gabbard, who comes from isolationist school. And in a way, J.D. Vance is viewed as potential successor of Trump. And then you have Marco Rubio and formerly Michael Waltz now Michael Waltz after the whole Jeffrey Goldberg Signal group chat out of the National Security Council. So before it was a very cohesive, and that led to the withdrawal from the Iran deal, the killing of Qasem Soleimani. That's the first Trump administration. The second one, you can see that there is actually internal conflicts about what to do within the administration. You have the only person I would say with the traditional foreign policy background is Marco Rubio, because he comes from some of these other, the ones I mentioned, like Mike Pompeo. Like the difference between Mike Pompeo and Marco Rubio is very minimal. So I think it's like the second one seems actually less affirming, let's call it, than the first one in terms of a very strong outlook. The player that actually is now becoming major one is Qatar and the relationship between him and Qatar. Well, we know that there's a couple of people that have one-way relationship have dealt with Qatar in the past. One is Steve Witkoff, who actually has properties that was bought by Qatar. And then you have, I think, Kam Bondi from the Department of Justice that used to be a registered lobbyist for Qatar.
Did she really?
So you have people within the administration now who have, one way or another, have dealt with Qatar financially. No conflict of interest here. So there's nothing. Everything is smooth. There's nothing there. So the thing with Qatar in terms of foreign policy, there's actually like an Arab proverb, which is like تقتل القتيل تضرب جنازته, which is I kill somebody and I show up at their funeral. So to translate that is that Qatar is both the disturber and the solution at the same time. They create issues and then then people come into them as the only solution. So that's in a way, in a nutshell, what is the Qatari foreign policy is. The Qatari position on Iran is, to give you one thing that is now actually trending across the region, is Iran. So United States and Iran want to have a conversation. The Qataris want to mediate. The moment the Iranians heard that Qataris would mediate, they accepted that unconditionally. They're like, oh, you guys want to mediate? Of course. And that is not the case for the entire region. Like if the mediation was done by Saudi Arabia, that would have taken months of conversation about what the conditions are.
Yeah, so why do the Iranians trust the Qataris?
Or what the Qataris trust? I mean, I think some of it is mutual. I mean, they share a lot of natural gas together. Qatar has always been
because they're divided by
on the
sea,
Arab Gulf. So there's a lot of oil and natural gas that is shared between Qatar and Iran. So they have an agreement. That is what I'll give you their official talking points. It's like, we have oil, etc. I think some of it is also regional. Is that Qatar doesn't want Saudi Arabia and the UAE to get too strong, and the existence of Iran actually helps keeping those people worried enough that they don't deal with Qatar. I think there's actually some of it is internal GCC infighting, and that's what actually resulted to a lot of cases with the blockade of Qatar by the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia that eventually kind of showcased a lot of the divisions between these countries. So I think that's where Qatar is mostly coming from, is that a weak Iran, I mean, that's, I would say, a position is like, we still want Iran to exist. The existence of Iran kind of makes us relevant. And we have a relationship with them, except they attacked the Udeid, which is the U.S. military base recently. But it was a show. It was just like...
It was retaliation at the end of the 12-day war.
Then they called the Americans and they called the Qataris, but they just wanted to show face. But I think that's the relationship. But that makes Qatar a very neutral player in the whole game. Domestically, internationally, they have played a major reason of funding the Muslim Brotherhood in the entire region. So that's their policy during the Arab Spring, was supporting. The reason why Muslim Brotherhood has become a significantly growing in the region is because of Qatar and the media arm of Qatar, which is Al Jazeera. If you are a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and you need a platform that has tens of millions of subscribers, you go to Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera is going to give you a platform. Would put them on a massive advantage than anybody else who's competing with them. And that makes them a completely non-neutral actor. And the fact that the Trump administration, the second Trump, is willing to kind of look at them as the good guys is absurd, in my opinion. I think, and I think some of it is because of all the conflicts of interest that are happening in the second administration. The first administration, Mike Pence never had deals with Qatar, never financially benefited from them. But now we have people in this administration who have good relationship. And also, in addition, you have the isolationists, and the Qataris, in a way, fulfill that isolationist gap because they tell them, no, the Middle East doesn't need your help. Stay away from that. And then they're like, oh, see, we have somebody in the region who wants that. And then it's a win-win for both of them. I
see. So just to illustrate your point about how they sort of play the troublemaker and then the peacemaker simultaneously, it was in Qatar that Hamas were allowed to, or the Hamas high command were able to take their and keep their funds, and it was,
and the Taliban
as well, and then it's of course Qatar who claim to be the place who want to negotiate peace. Although I think Witkoff was actually in Yemen, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, that was with. I think that was it was in Yemen with Iran. That's my mistake, rather than with regards to Hamas. So Qatar play this double role.
Yeah.
But what's been so alarming is Trump, accepting all these gifts. But not only that, Qatari money is going into America, particularly in various institutions, think tanks, universities, and it has clearly had a disruptive force. If you look at the results on university campuses and the politics of the students, that seems to me to not be totally natural. And it has been well reported. There's a journalist called Eli Lake who came on this show to discuss it, who revealed just quite the extent of Qatari influence in America. What was your opinion on Qatar's influence there? Is there? Do you think I'm wrong to think that they are being disruptors?
Of course. I mean, all of that money. So during the blockade, which is when the UAE and Saudi Arabia blockaded Qatar, I think the New York Times did a full extended report on that. I think DC made probably $100 billion of money flushed on them by one of those three countries. So that includes the think tanks, think tanks funded by the UAE, think tanks funded by Saudi Arabia, think tanks funded by Qatar. All of them being utilized as, to a large extent, lobby groups to advance Qatar's interest. So yes, of course. I mean, this is when Qatar is donating X amount of millions of dollars to Brookings Institute. It is no surprise that some members of Brookings Institute, without mentioning names, were supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and wanted to justify the positioning the Muslim Brotherhood as a moderating force. And if they only get into power, they will moderate over time. I moved to America in 2013, and I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2014. And I was interacting with a lot of these voices, a lot of these think tank analysts and to researchers. And these people have a lot of access during the time with the Obama administration. So they were, once in a while, they go do briefings at the State Department, their reports read by people at the... So you had people who were kind of Iranian lobby proxies to some extent, because Iran cannot have a lobby in the United States because they're a sanctioned government. So sometimes they do that through Qatar to fund certain voices. And you will see that, like I'm coming to the United States, and I was expecting the United States would be at least not necessarily friendly with them. Like I was expecting it to be antagonistic. Like actually was my initial belief that the United States would actually be antagonistic against theocratic Islamist force across the region. But when you go to think tanks that many of them were funded by Qatar, you will hear like, no, they're actually a moderating influence. If we only supported them, they would moderate over time. So yes, when Qatar is giving all that money, it's not a charitable donation. I mean, this is lobby influence to achieve certain policies, and mostly going to be policies favorable to them. They believe that, like Muslim Brotherhood, for example, is when they support it and they get into power, means they have allies in the rest of the region, and they want that approval from the U.S. So they want the U.S. to. So it's nothing they're doing is just, oh, here we saw Georgetown, they have nice football team, and we're and we're funding that. I mean, it is unfortunately. I mean, DC is. I don't want to like single out Qatar in this case. I mean, DC is really compromised with a lot of ways. I mean, when I left Washington D.C., I said like people who work in D.C. should be like Formula One, like when you have all the sponsors listed in your jacket, because you don't know in many cases whether you're talking to a foreign state agent or a state agent, or because everyone is like trying to play this game of I'm a lobbyist in this country and this country, and it's really troublesome. It actually makes America, in my opinion, much weaker, because I'm not as an American, it's like we don't have sovereignty on a lot of our foreign policy. We're not thinking of necessarily what's better for America, but rather what's all of these players are thinking and who's paying more. And that's really damaging to American foreign policy and America as a nation.
So how big a mistake was it for Trump to accept that money then? Is it as you describe, or does Trump put himself in a corner with Qatar? Does this mean now that he sort of has to play nice, or what's the trouble with it?
I mean, in the context of this trip, because he had the Middle East trip, right? There was all of this competition about who's paying more. And I think each one of them paid roughly trillion and a half, 1.3, 1.2.
Who you mean?
The UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar.
Okay,
so there was these three players that he visited in the region. I think the Qataris want to do something special that kind of shows more of their dominance, in which, and by the way, Qatar has one of the highest, I think the highest GDP per capita. So I think them and Luxembourg compete so they're a very wealthy country with a very low population. So
does that include the non-citizens?
No, but for the citizens. So they have and that's what the government kind of takes care of. So they're not worried about public rebellion whatsoever. Most of the people, their bellies are full, and everyone pretty much has a good time. So they were like, okay, we're not, like Saudi Arabia is a very large country, a big population. Their investments cannot be just gifts, right? It's part of the 2030 plan. They want to diversify their economy. They don't have the luxury of just, I think for Qatar, it was a sign that like, hey, we don't care. We can just throw our money out there. We're not expecting anything in return, quote unquote. So what is the mistake? Of course it was a mistake. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
that accepting any money, and also for security reasons. I mean, yes, of course, it's designed by Boeing or Airbus, and yes, we're gonna do further inspections, but I mean, like just accepting it from foreign nation that in that gray area between whether it's an ally or an enemy, and has offices of extremist groups, I would be worried about my security if I accept a gift from them.
Yeah.
This is
Yes.
like this is not a nation that is like just like a country that minds its own business. This is a country that funds a lot of militias and a lot of extremists all across the world. I would be quite worried about getting any gift from them.
Yes.
And I don't know what is the Trump logic other than it's a big beautiful plane that
Yes.
they're giving me, and I don't think, maybe like, because I think he's also surrounding himself with people who are compromised to some extent. Maybe they told him, no, it's good. We accepted money from them before, nothing happens. Maybe that played a lot in his thinking. Is that he's not like he has some people around him who agree that Qatar is actually a good mediator.
Why don't Qatar like the Saudis and Emiratis?
Well, it's I mean that needs 3 podcasts, but it's a lot of it. I mean, the GCC to some extent, yes, they're all Arabs, but they are different tribes and also people with different interests and not necessarily different visions, but different interests. And Qatar is a kind of a different family, but they're cousins to a lot of the, and they always see themselves a bit threatened by existence of larger players, predominantly Saudi Arabia, which is the most kind of dominant, at least in terms of financially and also in terms of people. So they've always had worries about somebody being much larger than them can tell them what to do. They also happen to be very lucky that they have one of the highest natural gas reserves in the world. So they are like, why are we don't want anybody else to decide our fate. We can decide it for ourselves. So I think that's really a big part. Some of it is, I think, is really ideological to some extent. I think, but they are. I would say yes, they have they are kingdoms. So in many cases, they're not motivated by ideology. But I think if there's one thing that you can draw between the lines, at least in their media coverage. I mean, most media in the Middle East is state-owned, except us, so that's a good thing. But
us in Iraq.
No, us in Ideas Beyond Borders. We're not a state-owned media.
Right.
But most media, and you can see most of the coverage of Al Jazeera, which is a state-armed, leans significantly towards the Muslim Brotherhood. So they're not, again, so they. I think it's important to look at them not just as only a financial, but they do have, to some extent, an ideology. Whether they believe in it themselves, a different subject, but they definitely see it as either through a populist lens. It's like, okay, these guys are popular, we're investing them, or they actually believe in what the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to achieve.
I've seen comparisons of what Al Jazeera is reporting in Arabic and what they're reporting in English, and they're completely different, right?
Reaching out to different audiences. I think Al Jazeera English, I mean, there's this famous joke is like, in English they're talking about saving the whales, and in Arabic they're talking about killing the Alawites. So that's, I would say, the main distinction. But in a way, they target two different audiences. The audiences in the Arab world, they want to move them towards the more Muslim Brotherhood vision, or by proxy. And the target in the U.S. is mostly targeted toward the left, which is, so most of AJ Plus viewers or AJ is mostly tend to be on the left. And the way they portray themselves is like, oh, we are more progressive and we care about progressive ideas and Black Lives Matter and all of these issues that they themselves don't follow in their country, right?
Why are they leaning to the left in the West?
I think appealing to, I mean, a lot of the left is a lot of focus on the concept of lived experience and focused on, they're from the region, they must know better, without really checking what's what. Is
it a version of sort of Islamo-communism, that Islamo-socialists, the Red-Green Alliance that we hear about?
I think some of it is that, but I think a big part of it is, and I think now their influence extends beyond the left. I think um, if there is one revelation I got after moving to the United States is a lot of people are very gullible to a lot of misinformation. And when people in the West start less trusting of their institutions, they don't trust the mainstream media in the West, they want to hear from voices in the region, and then they just happen to hear the most funded one, which is Al Jazeera. So they found a really big market on anybody who doesn't trust Western reporting in the Middle East, and they position themselves as the kind of the vanguard of the truth of the region. I think this is a big part of how, at least from a business sense, they became successful. They're filling a gap that the Western media to the Western people is not filling. And back to kind of the Iraq war and Afghanistan and stuff like that, is that I think they played a major role in kind of the large distrust of the American population of their media, right? It's like, oh, the U.S. media were talking about Iraq will be liberated, we're going to be welcomed by flowers and stuff like that. And now look up the news and there is soldiers being killed, there is civil war. So I think that's what I say, like my view is a bit changed in the Iraq war over time, is seeing how it affected the American psyche and allowed a lot of people not to trust any of these institutions. And you can see it now. You talked about the MAGA base. I'm very sure they also watch Al Jazeera or they quote it because they see, oh, it's kind of anti kind of the U.S. establishment and things like that. That's, I think, where they positioned and found themselves a market. And it's very intelligent. I mean, it's really, and nobody else in the region yet has been able to compete with that. Because they have really hired top-notch journalists from around the world. I mean, money helps, of course, and they brought like things that from the outside it appeared as a very legitimate, highly very good documentaries, very good reporting. So you see them as like, wow, this is like an awesome channel, without not knowing that a lot of it is actually part of a foreign policy agenda of Qatar.
Do you think Al Jazeera has been damaging during the Israel-Hamas war?
Of course. I mean, all of the kind of the perceptions of the entire...
Sorry, when I say damaging, I mean misreporting the truth.
That also goes in what the truth is, right? In terms, because of the fact that there is no foreign journalists allowed in Gaza, that also created a room for Al Jazeera to expand, right? We are the only channel that have insiders who can tell us what is the truth, because we don't hire foreign journalists, we hire local journalists. So in a way, it's like, I think a lot of the expansion of Qatar and their ability in Al Jazeera is a lot of it, I think, is self-inflicted. We allowed ourselves for our media institutions have failed. Our institutions in general have failed. We allowed, whether it's Qatar or other foreign actor, they're going to take advantage of that division. I think that's my hypothesis of the matters. If people don't trust their institutions, somebody else is going to come up and tell them, trust me, and they're going to go to him. And so I think we need to empower and create better, credible media in the West.
Yes.
That people are not looking for Qatar or Al Jazeera for a savior.
Yes. So, and that's a perfect plug for IBB, I'm sure, is what you're insinuating there, which we'll, of course, link to. But you've mentioned the Alawites there. I wanted to ask you about Syria. So we recently had a guest on, another Middle East analyst called Thomas Small, and a host of a very popular show called Conflicted. And I wanted to ask, seeing that he was so educated on Syria, what was going on with Jelani. And also, we are hearing of massacres, particularly of the Druze, between the Druze and conflict between the Druze and local Bedouin. And that we've also had reports of the Alawites being massacred, Christian reports, although
that's
Kurds,
yeah.
Yazidis. Now, Thomas put it to me that his analysis at that time, and I should say this was, which was a few weeks ago, was that there's conflicts between the Druze and the Bedouins, and it's kind of grazing ground style conflicts. The Druze themselves are quite militant, and though several hundred civilians as well as militants of them have been killed, Jelani sent in militants to try and separate these things. But having looked into it, it's hard for me to fully understand this, because if you look at who's attacking the Druze in the videos, it looks like they're wearing army uniforms. Yeah. And I wondered if you agreed with Thomas's analysis, or if you had any further light to shed on what's going on with that specific, the persecution of minorities in Syria.
I mean, it's well documented. I mean, we see it all in front of our eyes, so there's no denial on that. I mean, my position that Jolani actually, so it's interesting. So like his official name is Ahmed al-Shara, and that is now his new, I would say, the new face of Jolani, right? But you can see that he's switching between these two personalities at the same time. So he's ruling it in a very bipolar setting. And I'm very afraid the story of Syria is actually becoming a replica of the story of Iraq, in which the majority. So the difference between Iraq and Syria was we had the commonality is that we were both ruled by the Ba'ath Party of Iraq. We had, it was called the right-wing Ba'ath Party of Saddam Hussein and the left-wing party of Hafiz al-Assad. Hafiz al-Assad is Alawite, Saddam Hussein was Sunni. Both are minority within Iraq and Syria. Saddam Hussein was deposed. The Shia majority stood that as a revenge time to pretty much indiscriminately kill anybody or fight against anybody that they think was a beneficiary of the former regime, which eventually led to what it led in terms of a civil war and militarization of the minorities and all of that stuff. Al-Shara from the beginning, he made two major mistakes, in my opinion. Number one is, and that's what's debated, is we should change the name of Syria from the Syrian Arab Republic to Syria. That small change means that now the new Syria is actually an inclusive country between all the different minorities, and we're going to include them. He released this ridiculous constitution that they write, and then they put that. The second thing he put, so before, in most Muslim countries, you have Islam, or Muslim majority countries, Islam as a source of law, or Islam is the source of law. So many countries in the Islamic world want to combine between kind of modern laws and civil laws and Islamic law. So they put in the constitution, Islam is a source. Al-Shara comes in and put Islam is the source, which is pretty much a theocracy. Like you're saying, like it's going to be built on what mostly it's called Sharia law.
Jilani said that.
Yeah, in the new constitution. So from the beginning, that signaled to everybody else, except the Sunni majority, that you are now pretty much I mean, even maybe a slave is the right word. You're now the slave to the majority. We are now the new rulers, and many of his defenders are saying these kind of terminologies, is that now it's our time. You guys, the minorities, have been ruling for a long time. Now it's our time as Sunnis to rule, which is very similar to what Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq, and others, the Shias, were like, now it's our time to rule. And it started with the Alawites, right? Because they are in a way, the easiest target. Despite the fact that many Alawites who are against the Assad regime, so none of these groups, none of these minorities are monolithic in any shape or form. And I think that was purely revenge killing. Then the Druze, who had one formal agreement with Assad to have some form of, and then they went for them. And I think that's going to continue.
Sorry, so just to be clear.
Yeah.
The massacres started against the Alawites.
At first, yeah.
And then you're saying now they are against the Druze. But
yes.
You're saying it isn't just the Bedouins who are killing Druze or the fighting state. You're saying that Jilani is responsible. His government forces are responsible for those massacres. If
it's not his government forces, his actions.
Okay.
As simple as that. So of course, I think it was not directly if you look at now what government forces are, that's also a very big debate. So Jolani is what he was leading at. He was the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is called HTS, relative for HTS. HTS not only had Syrians, it had Uzbeks, Tajiks, Uyghurs, Chechens, all of these people. like he made this group, like you can call it like the Times Square of terrorism. So they made Idlib as the Times Square of terrorism. You had many of these people who were foreign fighters who came to Syria to fight with him. One of his first actions was like, thank you for fighting with me. You are now part of the Syrian army, directly or indirectly. So even if these people are not, let's say, generals of they're endorsed by the government. They're not enemies of the government. And he allowed these people to be empowered and what they did. So he created this kind of gray area where he can probably like play the good guy in this. Will be like, no, I didn't do it. Somebody else did. But his actions, whether it's, and that's the things that's in our paper, is the Syrian Arab Republic is a complete disregard of everybody else. The Kurds see themselves as a different ethnic group than the Arabs. The Druze is the same. So by default, you're calling Syria a Sunni Arab state. That by default is going to trigger everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So his actions are leading to this. However, the silver lining, I think, with him, and that's I would say, is that he's not acting alone on his own, right? You have Turkey, who allowed him a lot of support to be where he is. You have Saudi Arabia, who went and campaigned Donald Trump to remove the sanctions on Syria. Both Turkey and Saudi Arabia both feel responsible that they empowered this guy. So I think I still have some, I won't call it hope, but I think that if these two forces would be like, hey, we campaigned for you and now you're doing all of this and you're putting our name in damage because now their reputation is attached to him, they might either pressure him to leave, and I don't know what the solution to that would be, or force him to moderate. The third option, which I think is the worst, is if they give up on him. And then Syria becomes an entirely failed state with a bunch of militias killing each other until who the winners is, who has the most guns wins. And that's also going to go back to the role of majority because Sunnis are the majority and they will always going to have the advantage over the others. So like, I really hope that more pressure I think that there is a lot of room for really not rewarding him. I mean, I think the Caesar Act of the U.S. Congress continued.
Which act?
The Caesar Act, which is part of the sanctions on Syria that used to be part of the former regime. They continued that for a couple of years. They're showing him was like, hey, if you don't play it right, we might restore the sanctions and destroy your economy. We cannot play this, I'm going to discriminate against the minorities, making things the way I want them to be. No, you're not playing alone. And I think he has to be constantly monitored.
Yes.
Regardless. I mean, his past is quite interesting. Like his LinkedIn is filled of extremist groups.
Is it actually?
No. I mean, it doesn't have a LinkedIn.
Okay,
but like, even his interview, I think with Tony Blair, I think the interview was, and he started the interviews like, well, I had like a youth, and then I joined Al Qaeda, and but there was another opportunity, and I joined ISIS. It's like if he's switching between like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, and like he was like kind of switching which financial firm has better money. Like he's like a lost intern who was trying to figure out what is the best gig. Like that is literally some of the interviews. Like I found myself, I think that's the actual term. I found myself in Iraq fighting for a militia. What do you mean you found yourself in Iraq? You get parachuted in and you were sleeping? Like how did you end up in? And then it's like, I found myself in a prison. Well, you don't find yourself in a prison. You were jailed because you're a member of Al Qaeda. So he's an interesting character.
So
to say the least.
You mentioned that it's well documented, the massacres. I just wondered if you had details of what's going on, because I found it quite hard to see exactly what is going on the ground in Syria. And I wondered if you might illuminate me on specifics there. Well,
I mean, we published 2 articles on and it has very well detailed on, I mean, first with the Alawite massacre. There's a guy called Amjad Aoun. He's an Alawite who actually has a lot of families there and documented a lot of these things. So that's all in our publication, Middle East Uncovered, where people can actually see in detail. I mean, I think most of it, of course, there's going to be a lot of, again, foreign actors. Nothing in them in the Middle East, everything is so convoluted, right? So you have a lot of people who want to push certain narratives, right? One is the Iran narrative is that they want to destroy this guy. As simple as this. Because he is a buffer. I mean, before Syria used to be one of smuggles from money from Iran to Hezbollah. What do? You go through Iraq, you go through Syria, and they go to Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Now this guy is in the middle, and he's not a fan of them. So they have a great interest to make sure this guy is destroyed. So a lot of you, when you go on X or you go on many of the social media, you see a lot of these kind of things inflated by some of these, by the Iranian regime. However, that's
you think the Iran regime are inflating the reports about the Druze being killed?
Well, especially they were inflating mostly the Alawite part, but it's still true. So even if the Iranians are relying on something that's true, they were inflating something that was true. They were not making up something. There was mass killing of Alawites, and it started with a couple of HDS people were killed, and then they came in and started killing everybody. And the slogans that they were saying is, you Alawites are infidels and you Alawites are upstates. All of that is documented, and there's no, and that actually forced them to start an investigation. So if there was nothing, if the Shara government didn't do anything, they would just do they say like we were never involved and all of that, but they're still like doing an investigation because there is an actual massacres that happened. And yes, it was like we probably learned about them, and they were all over the and some of the misinformation that happened is like, no, it actually was the Christians who were killed, and that was obviously a tool to get the West, to people in America and stuff, to care, because nobody knows about the Alawites. That sounds like who are these people?
Right.
But if you say Christians, people will know what they're talking about. So yes, there's some of that, but there's no doubt. Like there's so much evidence happening. Even the institutions that I know some people might be skeptical about, whether it's Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, they all reported that this was happening, and nobody could deny it, even though many of these institutions were completely anti-Assad. So these are sources that are not necessarily coming from the pro-Assad propagandists, but actually coming from, to some extent in this case, neutral sources.
So I'm going to now ask you perhaps the most controversial topic in the Middle East, of course, is Israel. I wanted to specifically ask you about the recognition of Palestine as a state. Now, this is in the news, of course, because next month is the United Nations General Assembly, and several nations, Australia, France, Canada, Portugal, and others, have said that they will or are considering recognizing Palestine as a state. Sir Keir Starmer, my prime minister, here in Britain, has said that unless Israel agrees to a ceasefire before the General Assembly, he will recognize Palestine as a state, which is quite a remarkable conundrum if you think about, or proposition, if you think about what that means. So if they don't accept this, anyway, we'll get into specifically how ridiculous my prime minister's position is on that. But before we do you think that it is good or bad that these nations are to recognize a Palestinian state?
The short answer is good, and let me explain why. And I can tell you more about the Arab position generally on that subject. So what you have is the Israelis see it that the recognition of Palestine empowers terror. The Arab states see it that the recognition of Palestine fights terror. And I think that's where that big conversation or big debate is about. The way that Hamas came into existence was, a lot of it is a defiance of the PLO. Hamas as an entity was a terrorist group, which I do think is a terrorist group, started as like, screw this PLO people, they're too liberal or they're too secular, and they failed in achieving. They're too nationalistic. They failed in achieving the aspirations of the Palestinian people. Many people, and that includes allies of the United States, including countries which signed the Abrahamic Accords, like United Arab Emirates and like Bahrain, is that they see that if the Palestinian people have a state or get recognized as a state, because it's recognized in a lot of the Arab countries, then they now have a channel to address their grievances. away from utilizing militancy and extremism and be recruited to the extremist side of the story. So that's where, because I think everybody acknowledges that Palestinians have grievances. It depends whether you believe these grievances are justified, they're self-inflicted, they brought it to themselves, they did not bring it to themselves, the Israelis. There is a fact that these grievances exist. And if it's not just in Gaza, it's in the West Bank with the expansion of the settlements, etc. The question is how to address those grievances. When people have a state, then within that channel, that becomes a non-violent way of addressing grievances. And the PLO, at least since the Oslo Accords, have been committed to a two-state solution and the borders of 1967 and kind of a recognition of the Israeli state. So that is the position of what is, I think a lot of governments are recognizing. They're not recognizing Hamas as the official representative of Palestine. They're representing the PLO as the official of Palestine. Are these people corrupt? Yes, but so is Zimbabwe. It's a nation and their leaders are corrupt. The corruption argument is not significant to not recognize a state. There are a lot of countries in the world that are corrupt, but there are still states and they still have borders. And I think that's also created a conundrum for the Israelis. What are you going to do with the Palestinians? So now this limbo situation that we're in right now, you're gonna put, so these people are not citizens of Israel. If you make them citizens of Israel, then by default you double the Arab population, and that means Israel loses its Jewish identity or Jewish state as a central feature of that. And they are under occupation by Israel. But we give you this semi-whatever administrative thing that allows you to manage it. That is completely unsustainable and also still allows Palestinians and allows everybody to channel all their grievances towards Israel. Well, for example, let's look at the Arab Spring. I know it has what's sometimes called the Arab Fall and all of that. But if the Arab Spring showed is that when people have states, they actually take their grievances and address them to the government, right? That's why that's why Mubarak fell. That's why many of these regimes fell, because these people have a state, and then you tell them, okay, if there is no good electricity, well, you should go to your state and address that grievance, not go to, because now in a way it's like, there's an irony with Israel. It's like they always tell people like, we don't want to be scapegoated for your failures, or they become, but to some extent, they're creating themselves to be scapegoat of the failures of others. Because if you occupy other places, meaning the non-recognized part of Israel, recognized place of Palestine, you are allowing all their grievances to go towards you for the failure of governing these places properly. And they're not going to be properly because these people, meaning the Palestinians, want the recognition of their own state. Yes. So that's, I think, the main division, I think, between, if you read the Arab Peace Initiative, which was published in 2002, it included by Saudi Arabia that they would contact and actually sometimes even maybe force, but all majority Muslim countries to recognize the state of Israel. That is what they're offering in return. That if you actually recognize the state of Palestine, and now the Palestinians have full citizenship in their own state, we actually gonna go on your behalf and tell Muslim majority countries that don't recognize you, because for them, as having Mecca and Medina, they actually have leverage over a lot of these countries, that they would recognize the state of Israel. So this is, I think, where the division is of people who would say, like, no, well, recognition of Palestine. Yes, I think the conditions, unfortunately, like this, in my opinion, should have happened a long time ago, not in this now tumultuous times in which somehow it signals, okay, Hamas have achieved something by October 7th, and therefore they will get more land if they get that.
If I may, so a lot of what you're saying, if we're going to have that conversation, surely it's had in peacetime. Whilst the war is still going on, whilst there are Israeli hostages in Hamas tunnels underneath Gaza, the idea that you would reward or give such concessions to Hamas seems to me an absurd tactic of war.
But is it a concession to Hamas?
Well, the leader of Hamas, and I've forgotten his name because
there's a new one. Yeah.
There's a new one every week. It has actually thanked Keir Starmer for saying what he did about recognizing a state. So Hamas are thrilled that they're getting recognition as a Palestine state. Why? Well, you made the point that, well, why, apart from the obvious, but you made the point that Hamas wouldn't be recognized as the government, but they are the government in Gaza. And it is the case that if you recognize a state, presumably if the government of the state is the government, you are recognizing that they're the government, and unless you specifically say otherwise. And
that is what the declaration between France and Saudi Arabia says. It says that we call for the complete disarmament of Hamas, release of the hostages, and the power to the PLO. I mean,
right.
that is what the statement says. So none of the agreement, I think, in the United Nations would empower Hamas. And I think that gives the countries, meaning Palestine, the agency for them to say, okay, we have to get rid of Hamas in Gaza. Because now Hamas is not under their control, and they have no interest whatsoever to go and liberate it away from Hamas, because if they're not getting anything in return.
Doesn't this go back to my earlier point, though, that, okay, you can have that conversation, but after the war, you have that conversation when you're actually doing your post-war treaties. You don't do it before. You don't do it, and when Hamas say, oh, actually, there's another win for us. Look, we can go to our people. Look, we've now got recognition from these other states. Look, we actually got some wins for our cause here. It seems to me that tactically it's unbelievably foolish to have this conversation now.
I mean, people will always Saddam Hussein declared his victory over the first Gulf War. He said, see, I'm still in power, and even though in literal terms he got his ass kicked by the Americans and the Brits, and it was complete defeat of him. In reality, so many of these kind of terrorist groups of course they will say things like this, but if you also talk about the war itself, I think there is now a common consensus within even the right and the left that the war really hasn't achieved the objectives that it is, especially when it comes to Gaza. I think that when it comes to everything else, like, for example, Hezbollah is much weaker today than it was. That is a result of the pager attack and the constant attacks of Hezbollah. It's fair to say that everywhere else, Israel has achieved its objectives, except in Gaza.
It's not only achieved its objectives, it's done it's incredible.
And I think it's been 18 months, or actually more than 18 months, 20 months since the war.
It's nearly 2 years.
It's nearly 2 years. And it's really, what has been done hasn't worked. And in fact, I think it's like, if you look at the level of hate that Israel has right now, the fact that its continuation of the war damaged any future for Abrahamic Accords anytime soon, because no government if you go back to the history, I think, of why October 7th happened, it happened a month after MBS's famous interview with Fox News, where he was saying, we're getting so closer to sign a normalization agreement with Israel, and then Hamas did October 7th. Now a lot of people in Israeli intelligence connect the two dots, saying that it was happened because of that. So in a way, it's like, if the war is stopping you from achieving any regional integration, knowing that was why October 7th happened, then why continue the war? If the war is literally stopping something that is extremely major, in which Saudi Arabia and the Arab states recognize Israel, and a lot of trades, and hopefully a lot of peace and regional integration and more prosperity for the region, if all what it takes is understanding this agreement, and yes, discussing it, there might be, of course, going to be land this and land that, and what does it entail to have a Palestinian state, and which land that we will get. But I think it was dismissed outright, which is like, okay, we don't even want to discuss this at all. And I think it is to their own. I think it's making it worse for them than because continuing the war is not helping their objectives.
Because they're losing the propaganda war.
Not only they're losing the propaganda war. I mean, we look at different examples.
I think Netanyahu actually said that exactly last week.
I don't think it's a propaganda to say that what they're doing in Gaza hasn't worked, right? Is that it's the same way it's not a propaganda to say that what they have done in Lebanon actually worked, right? You can say it's like, okay, we're looking at the region as an entire region with different fronts, as the Israelis call it, the Iranian front and the Lebanese front. And you can see that in Lebanon, yes, Hezbollah still has some power here and there, but they are not in any way a significant threat to Israel anytime soon. You can objectively say, okay, they have achieved some big objective within that. Within the Iranian, even the 12 days war, they have weakened the Iranian regime significantly. A lot of nuclear scientists have been killed. The Iranian axis of resistance, so-called axis of resistance, is much weaker today. Iranian proxies, because of the threat of Israel, refuse to throw any rockets towards Israel. So you can see, I mean, in a way, it's like looking at it objectively, you can see that they have achieved XYZ objectives in these locations. But you can also see that they have failed, in a way, miserably in that other place. And I think that requires, because they have failed miserably in that other place, I think that requires, to some extent, some creative solution. Because now if Israel says, in my opinion, that, okay, we recognize Palestine, but part of our recognition is that all of these countries that are calling for peace, you need to help us get rid of Hamas. That is our prerequisite. You put it in the document that the Hamas should be disarmed, and we have, to some extent, failed in making that happen. We need your help. And that way, it's not just our responsibility, it's the responsibility of everybody who signed that agreement to disarm Hamas. Now, everybody else has an incentive to join in to disarm Hamas. Because now there's no, I mean, we keep hearing from sometimes some Israelis, well, UAE and Saudi Arabia should come and rebuild Gaza. Well, why? What is the incentive of why Saudi Arabia would send its army or sent to go fight Hamas, in a way, Arab killing an Arab? For what? Israel to be safe? Only that's not enough of a justification.
Well,
so no, but I think
well,
at the same time they can destroy it again, and all of the investments of the Saudi Arabia is just like you're burning it. You're literally burning $1 billion, knowing that. But I think if you give them an incentive, and the Saudis have made it very clear that they are not going to normalize with Israel unless there is a recognition of the state of Palestine. They have said that so many times, and I think with negotiations, sometimes you gain something and sometimes you lose something. And my opinion is like Israel will gain so much with regional integration, and it's worth the. And if that and having guarantees from these states who have, just like what I was telling you, when the Saudis championed the Syrian guy, now they actually have a responsibility over the Syrian guy, over Ahmed al-Shara, and they're gonna have also more responsibility on the Palestinian state because they have campaigned to make it happen. If the Palestinian state or the official one commits an act of terrorism, then it's appropriate to also handle that with the Saudis who will be like, you champion this, solve it with us. And I think that approach is much better than, no, we're fighting a war between good and evil, and it's a David versus Goliath, and we are the good guys and we're killing the bad guys. And obviously this is not working. I want to meet any Israeli, you can even hear people from the reserve who are exhausted and they just don't want to continue it. It's not working.
Okay, so with regard to the objective of defeating Hamas, I think,
including what that means.
But
I mean, what does when people talk about defeating Hamas, right? The same way what happened with the regime change wars of Iraq and Iran, right? Of Iraq and Syria. We wanted to dismantle the Ba'ath Party. Okay, the Ba'ath Party had tens of thousands of members. Some of them had administrative jobs. My school teacher was a Ba'athist, the administrator was a Ba'athist. And then there were people who were responsible for mass killing of the Kurds, right? When the de-Ba'athification story happened, part of the reason why the Iraq war failed was this idea, every Ba'athist is an evil, we have to remove them, even though these people have been in government for 30 years. What does dismantling Hamas actually means? And if you ask, does that mean dismantling the militant part of it, the political part of it, the administrative part of it, the ideology part of it, which is the military wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has tens of millions of supporters across the region? Does that mean Israel is going to kill 50, 60 million people to achieve its objective? And that's, I think, where back to like failure of the war on terror and things of that sort, is that if you don't have defined objectives, you really don't know whether you're winning or whether you're losing.
So, so the point I wanted to make is it's fair enough to have this engage in these such criticisms with regard to the objective of defeating Hamas. This is something I have thought about at some length. It's how do you defeat what is essentially an ideology, and this also applies to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which I'd also like to ask you about. They're supposed to be disarmed, but having met Hezbollah militants myself last week in Shia regions of Lebanon and Baalbek, and he told me himself he was going to hide his arms, it was clear to me, given the glaze over his eyes, that this was an ideology that wasn't going away. Now, so fair enough to have that conversation and your critique there of the Israel approach to Hamas, but they still have Israeli hostages under those tunnels, and so to have to proceed with that means for Israel to stop the war with those hostages there means to give up on those hostages.
Or this is another way for them to get the hostages back.
Well, that's not clear. So
that's I think where the debate is about, right? Is that recognition of a Palestinian state, and going also back to what does state mean? State means has its own forces, it has a government. By default of Palestine recognized as a state, Hamas would technically be a militia that is outside the state, and it's responsible of the state to get the arms outside of these militias and get rid of these arms. So that's where, to some extent, the solution to Lebanon, endorsed by Tom Barak and others, is empowering the Lebanese state, and the Lebanese state goes and gets rid of Hezbollah. Will that possibly lead to a civil war between not actually called a civil war, but a war between the militant Hezbollah and the state? Yes, that's possible. The same way would happen when the PLO or the Palestinian Authority would have a war with the militia, and there's going to be a war. And that's not the first war. There's 2007, Hamas did a coup against the Palestinian Authority, and what we know what happened afterwards. So I think is that, I mean, back to 50 hostages. Do you think now, okay, like they can expand? They're going to continue the war for 4 months? Do you think that's going to make them any day closer to getting those hostages?
Well, I tell you what, I don't think is going to help them getting the hostages is Keir Starmer, just to tie the loop on my earlier statement, saying if Israel don't accept the ceasefire by September, then Britain, the United Kingdom, will acknowledge Palestine's existence. So if they do accept a ceasefire, they have to give up their hostages. There's no ceasefire deal. There have been various ceasefire deals, which attempts at negotiations. The most recent of which, the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff said that Hamas are not good faith actors. They've no interest here in playing squarely, and so that does mean if you look at the way these ceasefire talks have gone, Israel would have to give up on those hostages. And your argument seems to me in response that, well, at the moment, the current program isn't getting those hostages back, or extremely slowly, but it is getting some hostages back, albeit slowly.
And at what cost? I mean, at what cost? I mean, now, whether you trust the Hamas Gaza mystery, you don't trust them.
What cost is that they've got bad reputation?
Well, 70% of Gaza is destroyed. But that's confirmed.
Yes, but the Israeli priority is the
hostages. But 70% of Gaza is destroyed. More than 50,000 people of Palestinians were killed. Yes, some of them are combatants, some of them are not, but the number keep increasing. I mean, these are decisions that are extremely difficult. There is no black and white. Like we. I mean, the thing is, like, if the cost is more 10,000 Palestinians killed, or more 10,000, and I mean, what will be the ratio that will be acceptable, not just for Israel, but for the international community? We have to kill 25,000 Palestinians for one Israeli, and then that's the kind of the value, the market value of an Israeli is 25,000 Palestinian. I think that the pressure that Israel is getting, to a large extent, is because of the lack of any plan, in my opinion. They don't actually have a plan for Gaza. And, well, to some extent, they had a plan for everybody else. The plan for Lebanon is weakening Hezbollah, empowering the state. That allows Hezbollah to be dismantled. With Iran is weakening it enough that they don't become a threat. With the Iraqi militias, they're too lazy. We're just going to threaten them and they're going to stop attacking us. But it's very obvious that they don't really have a clear plan on the Gaza question. And because
they've got an ever-changing plan. I mean, the latest being that they're going to occupy Gaza City.
And that will which means they have going to be holding literally a place that is 70% destroyed, with 99.9% of the population hating them. And that's part of the solution. So that means they have to kill more. It's as simple as that. They're going to be internal revolts. They're going to be here and there protests. So they have to.
Do you mean 99% of the population of Gaza
hates Israel? I mean, there's no doubt. If they don't hate them before, they hate them now. Like if there was some leeway of 10%, it's probably 0.1%. And
yes.
So I think
they might also increasingly hate Hamas, which they are.
Which they are too.
Hating Hamas.
One option is probably they hate both. Right? Is like they are saying there's an article by Hamza Hawadi, who was a guy you met in Gaza, who also said that the Gazans are also hostages to Hamas, which is true. So in a way, it's like both they're hostages Israeli under Hamas, and they're Palestinian hostages under Hamas by millions. So I think it's like looking at it in that is that at what's and that's what I think American missions, for example, in combating ISIS or combating Al-Qaeda back in Iraq, back to my story, they have largely succeeded. If you look at where ISIS used to be in Iraq and look at it right now, it's one of the most prosperous parts of Iraq. And yes, they have ISIS sleeper cells here and there in Fallujah and Ramadi. Ramadi right now, I know Donald Trump mentioned Fallujah recently about whether it's safer than D.C. Yes, in many cases, there's places of Fallujah safer than Washington, D.C. And part of the main strategy of the United States Army and what's called the Way, which is that we work with locals and we don't see the locals as a method to achieve our political... Actually, we work with the locals to achieve our political objectives. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist threat. They were a threat to the locals and to us, and we're going to create... And I recommend all the readers to read about the counterinsurgency of the Awakening Forces and the Sons of Iraq, in which there were movements in which the United States made it very clear in that war. And yes, there was buildings destroyed, and yes, there was mass bombardment, but it was very clear. Our goal right now was to liberate you from Al-Qaeda, and we're going to work with you, and most of the time it was the tribal leaders, to achieve that objective. And David Petraeus, who was the former head of the CIA, is credited with that mission, and that mission, for the most part, has succeeded. Now, many of these places, yes, with the help of the U.S. Air Force, and yes, with the help, because that was, and sometimes working with some bad actors like Iran to achieve that defeat of ISIS, but mission has been accomplished, and now some of these areas are doing much better than before. So we actually can look at successful examples of what counterinsurgency looks like when you have defined objectives and you know that there is, to some extent, a line between what's a civilian and what's a combatant. And sometimes that line is a gray, right? You might have somebody who was affiliated with Hamas, but now no longer likes them. The same way the United States Army worked with people who are former members of Al-Qaeda to feed the current members of Al-Qaeda. These are the situations of these conflicts. It's many cases, very brutal. Many cases, it's really hard to know but you can see that, again, my ultimate goal and my ultimate belief is a prosperity and freedom for the entire region. So that's the place that I'm coming from. So I'm coming from a place of that we are really my main kind of quote is that I want the Middle East where people can visit and people can escape. This is my ultimate model. It's more people visit the region than escape the region. And I see that regional integration and the idea of having trade and support between Arab states and Iran and Persian states and Kurdish states and Jewish states is beneficial to the entire region. And I think that we see that it was so important that Hamas wanted to destroy it. And that's why October 7th happened. So if Israel loses the track that this is what was actually trying to be stopped, and they focus to some extent on important, but with no plans, I would rather go with regional integration. And if this is what the Saudis want, give them what they want. Because everything you read about the Saudis, their vision is about more modernity, more development, more rights for women. Yes, they're not the Jeffersonian democracy in any shape or form, but they're heading in a direction that is prosperous. Would I would rather listen to what these guys are saying, or would I would rather listen to people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich who are thinking of some genocidal war between good and evil? I think if you look at the region as a whole, you can see which direction we should, I think, in my opinion, go to.
Well, on that note, Faisal, it's been fascinating talking with you. Thank you for illuminating me on the Middle East. And before we go to our Substack, where we have some questions from our Substack readers directly for you, is there anything you'd like to bring viewers and listeners to attention? Is there any website, or if they're on social media, anything that you'd like to bring to their attention?
Of course. So our organization is ideasbeyondborders.org, with the clear mission of supporting the freedom and prosperity across the region through education, supporting entrepreneurship, and changing policy. So what I would say a very holistic approach. One of our latest our publications called Middle East Uncovered. It is on Substack. For those who are interested in listening to voices of the region that believes in these values and really explaining that gray area, which I think a lot of this podcast was about, is that I don't belong into the school. I have my moral objective, and I believe I have moral, but also knowing how complicated the region is good to kind of have an open mind. And we built this publication called Middle East Uncovered, which is now rising a lot in the international affairs on Substack. So I recommend everybody to subscribe and support it.
I'll give a double endorsement because I read it also. In fact, you mentioned a young Gazan called Hamza earlier in this conversation.
Our latest fellow, yeah.
And he has been writing some incredible pieces, and his story is also quite remarkable. Tortured by Hamas in Gaza before escaping, and now speaking out, not just against Israel, but against Hamas. And it's cost him dearly to do so. It's a great publication that you have there, Faisal. Thank you. And let's take it over to the Substack. First question is from Hannah W. She asks, how many of your subscribers at Ideas Beyond Borders are from Palestinian towns?
So, very good, great question. Since the inclusion of...
AJ asks, why are Christians and Jews so heavily persecuted in the Middle East and now in England by immigrants from those areas?
I could probably dissect it to two kind of things.
Will there be a civil war in Lebanon?
A country that I've lived in Lebanon for a year.
So my last question is, did you get to see the famous USAID-sponsored $20 million Sesame Street production in Iraq?
I have seen it, yeah.
Did you actually?
Yeah, I would say I'm very de-radicalized because of that Sesame Street program.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show with Faisal Al Mutar. If you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk now, you will enjoy an extended conversation between me and Faisal where we discuss Hezbollah, the Sesame Street paid for by USAID, and a few other questions taken from our audience and viewers. That's winstonmarshall.co.uk. But otherwise, until next time, be well.